Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here because today's story is one that I think is going to land differently for a lot of you. Most of the men who come to this channel with a story to tell, and there are more of them every week, believe me, most of them will tell you they didn't see it coming, that they were ordinary guys, maybe a bit lonely, maybe a bit naive, and that Vietnam caught them off guard. And that's true. That's a real thing that happens. But today's guest is not that man. Today we're talking to Cobus van der Merwe. He's 47, he's from Pretoria in South Africa, and he spent 20 years as a detective in the South African Police Service. Violent Crimes Unit. 2 decades of interrogations, evidence, reading people for a living. This is a man who built his entire professional identity around not being fooled. And yet here he is. I'm not going to tell you what happened. That's his story to tell, and you need to hear it in his words. What I will tell you is this. By the time Cobus figured out what was going on, he had already done things he couldn't undo. And the way he finally got to the truth, I hadn't heard that one before. This one's going to stay with you. Here's Cobus. In his own words, I'll start with the job because the job is where everything begins for me. 20 years in Chiang violent crimes. That's not TV detective work. It's not sitting behind a computer pulling up databases and looking sharp in a blazer. It's crime scenes at 4 in the morning. It's sitting across a table from a man who killed his neighbor over a boundary dispute, watching his eyes, listening to the rhythm of his sentences, waiting for the moment his story trips over itself. And it always does. Every story trips eventually if you're patient enough and you know what you're listening for. I was good at it. I'm not saying that to sound impressive. I'm saying it the way a plumber says he's good at pipes. It was the thing I did, and I did it well. You learn after a while that people lie in patterns. There's the overcorrection. There's the extra detail that doesn't need to be there. There's the way someone will look directly at you when they're saying the one thing that isn't true, because they've practiced that bit. You stop noticing that you're noticing these things. It becomes how you see. The divorce came through in 2021. Annalie, 19 years. She left me for a colleague, a man named Don, someone I'd shared meal breaks with, someone I had once, in a moment that embarrasses me now, asked for advice about a case. The settlement was what it was. She got the house in Centurion, she got the backy, she got primary custody of our 2 daughters. I got my pension and a lump sum from my retirement package, and the understanding that the life those things were supposed to fund no longer existed. I moved into a furnished flat in Gazina, 1 bedroom. The furniture was beige, the carpet was beige. There was a small balcony that looked out over a car park. I want to say I was devastated, but I'm not sure that's the right word. I think I was more just reduced. Like something had been removed and there was a space there that I didn't know how to fill and didn't want to look at directly. My daughters called in the first months, regularly at first, then less. My younger one, Rihanna, went quiet almost entirely after the first year. My older one, Karian, would check in every few weeks. I told them it was fine. I told my old partner Brahm it was fine. I told myself it was fine. I ate a lot of Borrower's rolls from the garage down the road, and I worked 8 more months than I should have because sitting in that flat in the evenings was too quiet. I retired in early 2022. Left with the pension, about 14,000 rand a month, which converts to roughly 1,400 US dollars, and a lump sum I'd taken from my retirement package. A bit under 1.8 million rand. $95,000 give or take. I had no plan, that was the honest truth of it. I thought I'd figure something out. Vietnam came from Henny. Colonel Henny Pretorius, retired. Same rough vintage as me. I had gone through his own divorce about 3 years prior and ended up in Da Nang. He started sending me voice notes on WhatsApp. Henny was always a talker. The weather, the cost of living. How a beer was 40 rand and a bowl of noodles was even less. How the people were friendly. How he'd found himself again. Which was the kind of thing I would usually roll my eyes at coming from Henny. I dismissed it for 8 months. Southeast Asia had never been on my list of anywhere. I knew nobody there. I didn't speak the language. There were men on YouTube. I'd watched a few videos, I'm not going to pretend I hadn't. Men in their 50s sitting on plastic stools talking about how Vietnam had changed their lives, and something about it had always seemed slightly desperate to me, like they were trying too hard to convince themselves. And then one Wednesday in July, gray Pretoria winter, I was sitting in that flat eating a bowl of cereal. Wheat Bix, too much milk, it had gone a bit soggy. And Henny sent another voice note. 32 degrees in Da Nang. He'd been on a walk along the beach. He sounded easy in a way I hadn't heard him sound in years. I booked the ticket that evening. One way. Ho Chi Minh City. I want to say something now that I think is important, before we get to what happened. I want to say it clearly because I think it explains a lot of the decisions that came after. I got on that plane believing, genuinely believing, that I was not the kind of man this could happen to. Not because I was arrogant about it, or maybe I was a little, but because I had evidence. 20 years of evidence. I had sat across from people running every kind of game you can run on another person, and I had watched them fail at it. I knew the patterns. I knew the tells. I had, more than once, correctly identified when a witness was lying to me based purely on the timing of a blink. I told Brahm the night before I flew that he didn't need to worry about me getting into trouble over there. He laughed. He said something like, "Yeah, well, just be careful, Brew." I told him I didn't get fooled. Listen here. That right there is the sentence I wish I could go back and say differently. Not because it was wrong exactly. My training was real and it did protect me from some things. But there are things that training does not protect you from. I know that now. And that's what this whole story is about. Tan Son Nhut Airport. August. Chai and I walked out of the arrivals hall at just past 2 in the afternoon, and the heat came at me like a wall. Not unpleasant, I want to be clear about that. I grew up in Pretoria. I know what 35 degrees feels like in your chest when you breathe. This was familiar, actually. It just smelled different. Exhaust fumes and something sweet underneath, and the noise. God, the noise. Horns everywhere, overlapping. This constant conversation of motorbikes that didn't stop for a single second. I stood there on the pavement outside arrivals with my 2 bags, and I thought, all right, this is a real place. Henny had sorted me a serviced apartment in District 1 through some contact of his, a South African guy who'd been in HCMC for 6 years and ran a loose kind of expat coordination service, mostly for newly arrived Afrikaners who didn't know anyone. The apartment was on a narrow street off Le Loi, 6 floors up, small balcony, ceiling fan that worked, and air conditioning that also worked. I used both. The building had a woman at the front desk who brought me a key on a wooden block the size of a brick. I assume so guests couldn't pocket it accidentally, and she showed me to my room without smiling and without frowning. Professional, I respected that. The first week I walked. That was basically all I did. I'd been a walking man my whole career. You learn more on foot than you ever do in a car. And I wasn't going to stop now. I walked down to the river at Bent Nungae. I walked up through District 3 past the old French colonial buildings that are slowly being squeezed between glass towers. I ate at places where I was clearly the only foreigner, and pointed at things on menus I couldn't read and received food that was mostly excellent, and once was something I still can't identify. I drank café sua jaya from a street cart on the corner near my building every morning, iced coffee, sweetened condensed milk, strong enough to make your eyes water, and it cost about 15,000 dong, which is 60 cents. I noted this approvingly. Henny called me from Da Nang on day 3. He wanted to know how I was finding it. I told him it was fine. He asked if I'd met anyone yet. I told him I'd been there 72 hours, and no, I hadn't met anyone. And also, I wasn't there to meet anyone. He made a sound that I recognized as Henny not believing me, but choosing not to argue. He connected me with a few people. When there was a British man, Paul, taught English at a language school in Binh Thanh, had been in Vietnam about 4 years. Pleasant enough, but with the slightly worn quality of a man who'd revised his expectations downward several times and had settled into the gap. There was a Dutch engineer named Peter, who was in his mid-60s and had retired to District 7 after a career with Shell, quiet and methodical, good company. And there was an Australian named Craig. Craig was 49. From Brisbane, had come to Vietnam 2 years prior after a business that had involved jet ski rentals and had apparently not worked out. He was cheerful about this in the way Australians are cheerful about disasters. He bought me a tiger beer at a place on Bui Vien on my 4th evening and gave me what he called the orientation. He went through it like a checklist. Don't lend money, ever, to anyone, full stop. Keep your finances completely separate from any woman you meet for at least a year. Understand that any woman from a provincial family with a badge, which is most of them, is going to have family obligations that will eventually become your obligations if you let them. And this isn't necessarily manipulation. It's just how it works here. And you need to decide in advance how you feel about that before you're already emotionally involved. Don't put anything in her name. Don't get married in the first year. Learn some Vietnamese, even badly because it shows respect and because it means you can sometimes understand what's being said around you. I listened to all of this very politely. Craig was not a stupid man, I could see that. But he had the tone of someone who'd been burned and had concluded from that experience that the fire itself was the problem rather than his own decision to walk into it. I know that pattern too. I'd seen it in interview rooms. The man who's been wronged and has built a whole philosophy out of his wound. I was not going to be that man. By the second week, I moved to Thao Dien in District 2. Henny had recommended it, and he was right. It was a different kind of place. Quieter, greener, streets lined with trees that actually provided shade. Expat cafes. A Saturday market where you could buy cheese, which I found both absurd and welcome. I found a one-bedroom apartment down a hem off Xuan Tui Street for 14 million dong a month, about $560, and it had a small kitchen and a desk, and enough light in the mornings that I didn't feel like I was living inside a box. I settled into a routine. Morning walk, coffee, some reading. I'd brought 3 books and was already through one of them. Afternoons I'd explore. I took a grab bike up to Bin Than one day, walked through the alleys in District 4 another. I ate bun bo hui at a place near the Thao Jian market that cost 40,000 dong and was one of the better things I'd put in my mouth in recent memory. I was not unhappy. Not unhappy is different from happy. I want to be precise about that. There was still a lot of quiet. There was still the thing I wasn't looking at directly. But not unhappy was further along than I'd been in Gazina, and I was willing to count that. The coffee shop was on a corner about 4 minutes' walk from my apartment. It occupied the ground floor of a shop house, high ceilings, the original tile floor, those slow French colonial ceiling fans that move the air without making you feel it. They did good Vietnamese drip coffee, the kind that takes 4 minutes to come through the filter and rewards patience. I went 3 days in a row, partly because the coffee was good and partly because I didn't need a reason. On the 3rd day, she was there. She was at a table near the window with another woman, both of them in work clothes, clearly on a lunch break from somewhere nearby. Mid-30s, I thought. Neat. Not the kind of dressed up that announces itself. And she was talking, and the other woman was listening and laughing, and at some point she glanced across and we made eye contact for about a second and a half, and she looked away, and I looked away, and that was that. I went back the next day. She was there again. Same time, different colleague. This time she spoke first. Something about my book, which was face down on the table, and whether it was good. Her English was precise and slightly formal, the kind that comes from a French-influenced education system rather than TV and apps. I said the book was fine. She said she had tried to read that author once and found him difficult. I said I agreed with her. She nodded and went back to her conversation. I sat there and did the thing I always do. I assessed. No jewelry that was performing above her income level. No behavior that was scanning the room. She'd initiated conversation but hadn't extended it into territory that could be converted into anything. She was there with colleagues, not positioned anywhere or performing for anyone. She was, by every observable indicator, just a woman having coffee. I messaged Henny that evening, told him I'd met someone interesting. He sent back 3 questions in rapid succession. I told him to relax. I told him she seemed genuine. She was not like the ones Craig had warned me about, I said. She was different. I believe that. I want to make sure you understand that part. One completely, genuinely believed it. Her name was Lynn. I got her number before I left the cafe. She gave it without hesitation and without performance. And when I walked home along Xuan Tui with the evening motorbikes going past and the smell of something being grilled on a cart somewhere nearby, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't name it then. I should have. We started slowly. That was the thing about it. There was no rush, no push, nothing that made me feel like I was being managed toward anything. We met for coffee twice in the first week after I got her number. The same shop house, same slow ceiling fans, same Vietnamese drip coming through the filter. She worked the morning shift at a boutique hotel on Nguyen Van Huang, maybe a 10-minute walk from the cafe, and she'd come on her lunch break. We'd talk for 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. Then she'd go back to work. She was 34. Tourism management degree from a university in the city. She'd come up from Binh Duong province for university and stayed on afterward, which is a common enough story here. The provincial kid who makes it to the city and doesn't go back. She managed front-of-house bookings, dealt with foreign guests, spoke English and some French. And she talked about her job with a particular kind of satisfaction. Not excitement, exactly. More like the quiet pride of someone doing something they're competent at and not taking it for granted. She didn't ask me about money. I want to be very specific about that because it was the thing that mattered most to me at the time. In those first weeks, she didn't ask what I'd done with my career, or whether I owned property back in South Africa, or what my financial situation was. She asked about the work. She wanted to know what a violent crimes detective actually did day to day, whether it was anything like the American shows she'd watched. I told her it wasn't. She asked whether it had changed how I saw people. I said yes. Then she thought about that for a while and then said she thought working with difficult foreign guests had done something similar for her in a smaller way. That stuck with me. I noted everything. I couldn't help it. It's the training. You're always building a file. What she ordered, whether she checked her phone during conversation, how she spoke about other people. She ordered the same thing every time, a café sua ja with less condensed milk, and she paid for it herself without making a point of it. She didn't check her phone excessively. She spoke about her colleagues with mild affection and mild frustration, the way people do when they're being honest rather than performing. She spoke about her parents with something more careful, a particular kind of steadiness that I associated at the time. Eat with someone who is responsible for people and has accepted that. That was the first thing she told me about her family, that she sent money home each month. 8 million dong, she said, about $320, to help with household costs. Her father had been a construction laborer for 30 years and his body was catching up with him. Her mother ran a small food stall in Binh Duong that covered basics but not much more. Lynn was the eldest of 3. Her younger brother worked locally and her younger sister was still in secondary school. She said this the way someone mentions their rent. Matter of fact, no performance around it, no bid for sympathy, no sideways look to gauge my reaction. I registered it as a fact about who she was, a responsible person, a person who came from people who worked for what they had and who understood obligation. I told Henny about this. He sent me back a voice note saying that was very admirable, and also to be careful, because in his experience, that kind of information always came before a request. I told him he'd become cynical. He said he preferred the word experienced. We went back and forth on that for a bit. The thing is, though, he wasn't entirely wrong. I can see that now. He wasn't wrong about the pattern. I was just, failing to distinguish between a genuine cultural reality and a setup. And here's the thing I want people watching this to actually understand, because I've seen the comments on these videos and a lot of them miss it. The family obligation is real. It's not an invention. In Vietnam, and the eldest child, Ca Dinh Nay, and especially the eldest daughter, carries genuine weight when it comes to supporting parents. It's not manipulation to expect your partner to contribute to that. It's simply how the social contract works. Any Vietnamese man in Lynn's position would face the same expectations from his family and from hers. The problem wasn't the obligation. The problem was what was underneath it. But I'm not there yet. Those first 3 months cost me, on average, about 10 million dong a month. Around $400, that covered dates, meals, a few small things. I bought her a scarf from the market off Thao Zien Road, maybe 200,000 dong, $8, because it was her birthday, and I didn't know what else to do, and it seemed like the right size of gesture. I was covering her coffees, covering dinners, and sometimes she'd insist on paying for something small and I'd let her because it seemed important to her. Most months I spent less than $400 total on the relationship. I've spent more than that on a bad weekend in Johannesburg. I barely registered it. What I registered instead was the absence of pressure. No demands, no escalation. She wasn't, as Craig had described with such relish, asking me to fund anything. We were just 2 people spending time together, and I was paying for things because I was the one with more money. And that seemed obvious and correct. I think about month 3 a lot, actually. The specific evening near the end of it, we were at a Quan Nao near her apartment in Binh Thanh, plastic stools, Bia Saigon, a plate of grilled pork that cost about 60,000 dong and was excellent. And she mentioned, not for the first time, that her father's knee had been getting worse. He'd been putting it off, the proper treatment. Public hospital waiting lists in Vietnam are long, she said, and the private option cost money the family didn't have. She named the figure without being asked. 45 million dong, about $1,800 for the full procedure at a private clinic. She said it the way you'd say a weather forecast. Factual. Not directed at me. She went back to her beer and changed the subject to something about a difficult guest at the hotel. I asked some follow-up questions. I told myself I was gathering information, not being led. That's a sentence that sounds better in my head than it does out loud. We made plans the following week to drive up to Binh Duong. I offered the hire car. She didn't ask for it. That distinction felt important to me at the time and feels less important now. The drive to Binh Duong took about an hour in the hired car, heading north out of the city on Highway 13. And the road starts straight and wide and then narrows as the industrial estates thin out and give way to smaller towns and then actual countryside. Flat, green, the occasional water buffalo standing in a roadside field looking like it had an opinion about traffic. Lynn sat in the passenger seat and gave me directions and talked about her family in a way that felt preparatory rather than anxious. She was briefing me, I realized. Managing expectations. He's quiet, her father. Her mother will give me too much food and I should eat it. The family home was in a residential district about 15 minutes from the main Binh Duong town. A narrow terrace house on a street of similar houses, 3 stories. The exterior painted a faded yellow that might have been white once. Small front step. A Honda Wave parked against the wall. The door was open. And I noticed things the way I always notice things. The front room had framed school photographs on one wall. Lynn and her siblings at various ages, all in white ao dai uniforms. There was a small altar in the corner with a photograph of an older man, incense sticks burned down to stubs in a brass holder, a glass of water. Someone's grandfather. The floor was tiled, clean. The furniture was old but looked after. It was the home of people who took care of what they had. Her mother appeared from the kitchen almost immediately and began feeding me. Ban Quan first, then a bowl of something that turned out to be a pork and vegetable soup I couldn't name, then fruit. I ate all of it. It seemed like the right thing to do, and it was also genuinely good. Her father came in from the back of the house. He was a broad man, built for heavy work. Nobody was moving carefully, my Andy placing his left leg with deliberate attention, the way people do when something hurts and they've been hurting long enough to root around it automatically. He was maybe 60. His face was weathered and direct. He shook my hand, both of his, which is a Vietnamese gesture that signals something: respect, welcome, sincerity. I've thought about that handshake a lot since. The younger brother was there too. Min. Late 20s, quiet, watchful. He didn't say much in English and didn't pretend otherwise. He assessed me from across the room, which I respected. He was doing what I would have done. Lynn translated throughout. Her father would say something and she'd give me a version of it. At one point he said something and she said, "He says thank you for looking after her in the city." I nodded. I told Lynn to tell him it was a pleasure. I didn't ask for a word-by-word translation. I accepted the version I was given. I've thought about that too. The visit lasted about 3 hours. It was warm. Nobody performed. There was no sales pitch, no pressure, no moment where I felt like I was being evaluated for a purpose. We drank tea and talked about things I could follow and things I couldn't, and Lynn moved between Vietnamese and English without effort. And by the time we left, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was that I understood her better now. Where she came from, what she carried. A woman who sent 8 million dong home every month and kept her father's situation in mind without making it anyone else's problem unless she absolutely had to. We were on the highway back to the city, the light going orange over the industrial estates, when she said it quietly. She was worried about his knee. The waiting list for the public hospital was 6 months, maybe more. The private clinic could do the procedure in 2 weeks. The cost was 45 million dong. She wasn't asking. She was just saying. I said I'd cover it. She said no, that wasn't what she was. I said I knew that, and I'd cover it. I want to be honest with you about the decision-making process here because I've turned it over many times, and the honest version isn't flattering. It wasn't purely generosity, it was partly that, yes. 45 million dong was about $1,800, and that was a real amount of money for a family who didn't have it, and a man who did. And that discrepancy seemed like it had an obvious resolution. But there was something else. That day in the house in Bin Duong, watching her father move carefully around his own kitchen, I had felt for the first time in a long time like I was part of something, like I was present inside someone else's life in a way that mattered. And paying for the surgery was a way to stay in that feeling. I wired the money within the week. The procedure was done within 2 weeks after that. We drove up again to visit him about a month later, and he walked down the front step to meet us without the same careful placement of his foot. The handshake again, both of his. He said something that Lynn translated as, "Now I can work again properly." I told Henny. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Brew, that's a good thing you did." And he didn't add anything to that. Just let it sit. The next 2 months were the best of the whole thing. I was spending more time at her apartment in Bin Tan than at my own place in Tao Jian, and eventually it became simpler to acknowledge that we were living together in the practical sense. She cooked. I was a reasonable cook myself. You learn when you live alone long enough, and we'd make meals together on weekends. Calm tam with broken rice and grilled pork, or the simple salads she liked with shredded green mango. We had a routine. It was quiet in the same way that the Jazina flat had been quiet, but the quality of it was completely different. The marriage conversation came from her. I want to be clear about that, not to assign blame, but because the framing matters. It was a Tuesday evening, we'd eaten, I was reading. Rai and she raised it practically. If we were going to continue living together properly, she said, there were practical advantages to formalizing things. My visa status as a tourist could be more stable if I was married to a Vietnamese citizen. I could apply for the 5-year exemption rather than managing 90-day tourist windows. It would be easier to open a joint account. We could get a larger apartment in Tao Jian properly, rather than splitting time between two places. It made sense. She was right that it made sense. I want to be fair about that. The logistics were accurate. I sat with it for 2 weeks. I raised it with Henny, who said he thought it was fast and that I should be careful, but that he also trusted my judgment, which was generous of him given the subsequent events. I didn't raise it with anyone else. Not Brahm, not my daughters. I messaged Carrion and Rihanna a week after the registration to tell them I'd married someone. Carrion replied 2 days later. One line, "Okay, congratulations." Rihanna didn't reply at all. I moved past that quickly at the time. I'm not going to move past it quickly now because that silence was telling me something and I chose not to read it. But we were married, and that is where the wall started. The registration was at a government office in District 3. A beige room, a desk, some paperwork, 2 witnesses from her side of the family. The whole thing took about 40 minutes. We had dinner that evening with her parents and Min at a restaurant near their hotel in the city, a clean Bunbo Hu place on Jin Tian Huang that her mother had chosen. The food was good, and her father toasted with a small glass of rice wine and said something that Lynn translated as, "May your home be peaceful." I thought that was a reasonable thing to wish someone. There was no ceremony in any larger sense, no speeches, no white dress. This suited me. I'm not a man who needs ceremony. I'd had ceremony the first time, and it hadn't been a reliable indicator of anything. I sent the message to my daughters the following week. Kept it brief. Married a Vietnamese woman named Lynn. She works in hospitality. You'd like her, Carrion replied after 2 days. One line, politely worded, not especially warm. Rihanna sent nothing. I noted this and set it aside. I'm setting it aside less easily now. The joint account was opened shortly after the registration. I want to be accurate about why. It was practical, genuinely. We were moving into a larger apartment together in Thao Jian, a proper 2-bedroom place on a quieter hem off Quoc Huang Street that cost 18 million dong a month, $720, which was reasonable for what it was. I put 220 million dong into the joint account as the initial deposit, about $8,800. That covered the rental bond, first and last month, furniture we needed, some kitchen equipment. I tracked every item. The numbers were accurate. I wasn't being careless. A month after we moved in, Lynn told me about Min. He had premises, she said, a space in Bin Duong near their parents' neighborhood, previously used as a storage unit, which the landlord was willing to convert for a motorbike repair business. Min had the skills. He'd been working informally for a mechanic for 2 years and knew what he was doing. What he needed was startup capital for equipment. Lift, tools, compressor, the basics. The figure was 85 million dong, about $3,400. She framed it as a loan. He would pay it back as the business got established. There was a vague structure, monthly repayments once he was earning. I asked some questions. I asked whether he had other customers lined up, whether the landlord had given him a proper lease, whether he'd costed everything correctly. The answers were plausible enough, not watertight, plausible. And I knew, as a former cop, that plausible wasn't the same as true, but the amount wasn't going to end me. And there was cultural logic I'd come to take seriously. I was the husband of the eldest daughter. I was by local standards a man of means, and Min was trying to build something for himself, rather than just asking for money to spend. I said yes. The loan was never repaid. I don't know if it was ever intended to be. Over the next 3 months, the request came in smaller denominations and more frequently. A semester of university fees for a niece in Bin Duong, 12 million dong, about $480. The mother needed dental work. 8 million dong, $320. Each one came through Lynn, explained reasonably, not excessive on its own. I paid each one individually. I didn't lay them next to each other and look at the shape they made. Then came Tet. I want to explain Tet to anyone watching this who hasn't experienced it, because it's not what Westerners imagine when they think of a holiday. Tet is the Lunar New Year. It's the biggest event in the Vietnamese calendar, and it is, among other things, a significant financial moment. There are liek chi, red envelopes of money given to children, to elderly relatives, to anyone junior to you in the family hierarchy. There are new clothes. There are contributions to the family gathering, the food, the decorations. The expectation is not optional and it isn't invented. Any Vietnamese husband, local or foreign, would be expected to contribute at this level. Lynn explained it carefully and without embarrassment. This is what we do, she said. This is what it means to be part of a family here. She was right about that. I want to say it clearly. The Tet expectations were real, and they were not unreasonable by Vietnamese standards. I spent about 32 million dong across the full period, $1,200 to $1,300. Some of that went to her parents, some to envelopes for younger relatives, some to the gatherings themselves. I sat at her family's table in Bin Duong on the first day of the new year and ate and drank and watched the firecrackers. They're technically banned, but nobody enforces it. And I was, if I'm honest, content. I want to stop for a moment and just give you the number. By the end of month 8, I'd put in roughly 550 million dong across everything. That's about $22,000. The surgery, the joint account setup costs, Min's loan, the smaller family expenses, Tet, the 3 months of dating before that. How, if you'd asked me to name that figure at the time, I'd probably have said 15,000, maybe 16. I'd been tracking individual transactions, but I hadn't summed them. Each one had felt like one brick. I never looked at the wall. I'm looking at it now. It's fine. I need you to understand it was still fine at that point. I had $67,000 remaining plus a pension that covered my living cost with money to spare. This wasn't a catastrophe yet. The catastrophe would have come 6 months later, I think, if I hadn't done what I did. Property in her name, maybe. Or a family medical emergency with a much larger number attached. That's what the trajectory pointed toward. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a Tuesday in early autumn when the thing I can't quite name happened. She came home at about 8:30, said she'd been out with a colleague from the hotel, a woman named Than. They'd gone for dinner in Bin Than. There'd been traffic coming back. She named the restaurant. She described what she'd ordered. She said Than sent her greetings. The story was fluent, detailed. It should have been convincing. There was a gap in it. Not a factual gap I could identify. Nothing she said contradicted anything else she said. It was something in the rhythm. A 17-minute window in the sequence of her evening where the pacing shifted slightly, where the detail density changed, where she moved through a section of the story a fraction faster than the surrounding sections. It's not something I can explain precisely. It's something you develop after you've listened to hundreds of constructed accounts. The story had been rehearsed, And the rehearsal was very good, and I would not have noticed if I hadn't spent 20 years noticing exactly this. I said nothing. I asked no questions. She went to make tea, and I sat in the living room of the apartment we'd set up together, and I felt something settle in me that I recognized from work. That particular cold stillness that comes when a case opens up in a direction you didn't want it to go. I didn't sleep much that night. I was already planning. I didn't confront her. I want to be clear about that because a lot of men in my position they'd have come in hot with accusations, given her the chance to deny everything, and ended up with nothing but a bad atmosphere and a wife who now knew to be more careful. I'd seen that play out in interview rooms more times than I could count. You confront too early, and with something that can be explained away, and you lose your advantage permanently. I needed something she couldn't explain away. I also want to be honest about something else. I didn't check her phone. I could have. She left it charging in the kitchen some evenings. But phone evidence is the weakest kind. It can be deleted, it can be misinterpreted. It requires her cooperation to unlock. And if I found something and she knew I'd looked, I'd have tipped my hand, and the only thing that would change is she'd become harder to catch. Beyond that, I was too proud. I know how that sounds, but there it is. What I did instead was think like a detective. I asked myself, if I wanted to establish whether this person was operating a secondary financial scheme targeting foreign men, what evidence would be definitive? And the answer came to me fairly quickly because it's the most direct possible test. I'd create the target and see if she approached it. Vietnam Cupid. I'd heard it mentioned by Craig and by a few others in the expat community as the platform where this kind of operation typically ran. I hadn't given it much thought before. I gave it a lot of thought now. I built the profile over 2 evenings while Lynn was at work. David Hartley, 52 years old, from Sydney. Recently widowed, his wife had died of cancer 18 months prior, which I chose because it gave David a credible reason to be lonely without being red flag obvious. Retired. Comfortable pension and superannuation. Looking for genuine companionship open to Vietnam long term. I used a stock photo from a site that sold royalty-free images. A gray-haired man with a forgettable face. The kind of man you'd walk past in a shopping center and not remember 5 minutes later. I wrote his profile description in the slightly uncertain, slightly hopeful tone of a man who had never used a dating site before, and wasn't sure he was doing it right. I want to be precise about this. I made David sound exactly like the man I had been 10 months ago. I set the search location to Ho Chi Minh City, and I started looking. The first 3 days I found nothing. I was hoping for nothing. I want to be honest about that too. Every day that passed without her profile appearing was a day I could tell myself the 17-minute gap had been something innocent. Something I'd misread, a story that really was just a story. I wanted to be wrong. I'd never wanted to be wrong about anything in my career, but I wanted to be wrong about this. Day 4. Her profile appeared in the search results. It was Lynn. Different photos from the ones she'd ever shown me or posted on Facebook. These were calibrated differently, more deliberate. There was a version of her in those photos that was aimed at a specific kind of attention, and it wasn't the version that came home each evening and cooked dinner. The profile said she was 29, she was 34, and described her as recently separated and living independently in Ho Chi Minh City. Her activity status showed she'd been active within the last 24 hours. I sat with that for a while. Then I sent her a message as David. Day 1 was pleasantries. Where was she from? What did she do? She responded within the hour, warm and curious, her English precise in the familiar way I recognized. Day 2. She established her situation more clearly. Recently separated, she said, it had been difficult. She was living on her own now, which was an adjustment. Independent. She liked District 2. Day 3, I had David mention his wife, his loneliness, his comfortable retirement income, which he described in vague but clearly substantial terms. The warmth in her responses increased noticeably. Day 4, she asked where David was staying in the city, whether he owned property back in Australia, whether he was planning to remain in Vietnam permanently or just visiting. Day 5, she suggested coffee. Somewhere in Thao Gian, she said. She knew the area well. Day 6, she was describing where she lived. The apartment. Thao Gian? District 2, our apartment. I took screenshots throughout, 7 pages by the end. I closed the laptop on day 6 without arranging to meet her. I didn't need to meet her. The evidence was complete. I sat at the kitchen table. There was a San Miguel I'd opened and forgotten about. It was going warm. Outside, Thao Jian was doing what it always did in the evenings. Motorbikes on Kwok Huang, someone's karaoke drifting from a few streets over, the smell of something frying from the hem below. All the ordinary sounds of the place I'd been living in for 9 months. I did the arithmetic. Not the financial arithmetic, I do that later. The other kind. The arithmetic of everything that had to be true simultaneously for those 7 pages to exist. She had maintained an active profile on a dating platform for foreign men throughout our relationship. She had described herself as recently separated and living alone. She had asked within 6 days of initial contact about property ownership, pension income, and long-term residency plans. She had done this while living in the apartment I was paying for, in the marriage I had agreed to, in the life I had believed we were building together. And she had done it with a fluency that told me this wasn't the first time. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I've processed worse crime scenes than this, and I know what shock looks like in other people, and I know what it feels like in myself, and what I felt sitting there was neither of those things. It was something closer to recognition. The cold, unsettling feeling of a case that has just resolved in a direction you didn't want. The next 2 weeks I said almost nothing unusual. I went through the daily motions. I watched her carefully for the first time since the beginning, and what I noticed was that my silence didn't alarm her. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't seem to notice anything had shifted. That told me something too. I contacted a lawyer, a Vietnamese attorney who worked with foreign nationals in District 1, recommended by the Dutch engineer Peter, who'd had his own legal complications years earlier. I laid out the situation in a single meeting. He was not surprised. He told me the marriage dissolution process would take approximately 4 months, cost roughly 100 million dong in fees, about $4,000, and that provided there was no jointly held property in either name, which there wasn't. The process was manageable. He told me to move my money before I did anything else. I moved the money, everything I'd contributed to the joint account that remained, transferred to a separate account she had no connection to. I ensured my pension was routing to an account with no Vietnamese access. I documented everything I could document. Then I chose a Sunday afternoon. She was home. The building was quiet. I put the 7 pages of screenshots on the kitchen table. I didn't say much initially. I let her look. Her face moved through several things in the space of about 30 seconds. First, the assessment. How much does he actually know and from where? And then the calculation. Is there a version of this that can still be managed? Then, when she noticed the joint account balance on her phone and understood the money had already gone, something colder. She said I had spied on her. I told her she was correct. She said I had no right, that I was paranoid, that what I had done was a violation. I told her the profile had been active for at least 9 months based on the activity data, that she had exchanged 43 messages with David Hartley from Sydney, and that on day 4 she had asked him whether he owned property in Australia. She went quiet. Then she made one more move. She talked about the marriage, about her father's health and what I had done for him, about the family, the obligations, what it meant that she had brought me into her home. She talked about it with a real quality in her voice that I want to be precise about, not fake. The feeling behind it wasn't fake. And that was the most difficult moment in the whole thing. Not because it moved me toward changing my decision, but because I could see exactly how it had been constructed, and I could feel, somewhere underneath the cold stillness, exactly how much I still wanted some version of it to be real. I didn't respond to any of it. I told her the legal process would begin the following week. I picked up my phone and I walked out of the apartment and down the hem onto Kwok Huang Street, and I kept walking. I'm in Chiang Mai now, Thailand, not Vietnam. I want to say that without making it sound like a statement about anything other than geography. I'm not here because Thailand is better or because I've sworn off one country in favor of another. I'm here because nobody knows me here. And after everything that happened, that felt like what I needed. It's a quieter city than Ho Chi Minh City. Cooler, up in the hills, especially in the mornings. I have a room in a small guest house off Niman Road with a balcony that gets decent light and a fan that works without the air conditioning if the temperature stays below 30. The pension clears into my account every month, same as always. $1,400. In Chiang Mai, that covers everything comfortably with money left over. I have a coffee in the morning at a place down the road. I read. I walk. I am, again, not unhappy. Now let me give you the numbers. I want to do this clearly because I've noticed that when people tell these stories, they tend to either understate the losses out of embarrassment or overstate them out of drama. And neither serves you if you're watching this because you're thinking about doing what I did. I had the surgery for her father's knee. 45 million dong, $1,800. The joint account initial deposit covering rental bond and setup for the Thao Jian apartment. 220 million dong, $8,800. Min's workshop loan, 85 million dong, $3,400. The smaller family requests across months 5 through 8, the niece's university fees, the mother's dental work, a few other things I haven't cataloged individually, roughly 80 million dong, $3,200. Tet expenses, 32 million dong, $1,280. 3 months of general relationship costs before any of the above, roughly 87 million dong, $3,500. Legal fees for the dissolution, 100 million dong, is $4,000. Total, approximately 650 million dong. Call it 26 to 28,000 US dollars depending on exchange rate fluctuations. I have approximately $67,000 remaining from my original fund. My pension is unaffected. I want to be clear about this not to suggest the losses don't matter. They do. But because the story's usefulness to you depends on you understanding that this was a close call that I caught, not a catastrophe I survived. If I'd waited another 6 months, I think the next ask would have been something structural. Property in her name, most likely. Or a significant medical emergency with a number 5 times larger than anything that had come before. That's what the trajectory was pointing toward. I got out before we arrived there, and the divorce took 4 months. She didn't contest it. She was gone from the apartment within 2 weeks of the confrontation, and by the time the legal process concluded she was, from what I could tell, simply somewhere else. Living her life. I don't know who came after me. I hope he was careful. I suspect he wasn't. I called my daughters after it was final. Not to explain myself, not to ask for anything, just to call. Rihanna didn't answer. I left a message. Karian answered on the second ring, and we talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Vietnam. Her job, her boyfriend, who she'd mentioned only twice in 2 years. A camping trip she'd taken. It was the longest conversation we'd had since before the divorce from her mother. I'm not calling that a redemption arc. It's too early for that. And I don't trust neat resolutions. But it was a start. I'm flying to South Africa for 2 weeks later in the year, and I've told both of them, and one of them said she'd try to come for dinner. Now I want to talk about the thing that actually went wrong, not the scheme. The scheme was simple enough, and I eventually recognized it. The thing that went wrong is more embarrassing than a scheme. I was professionally trained to read people. 2 decades of it. And I failed anyway. Not because my training failed, but because I applied it selectively. I used it to build a case for her genuineness in the first 3 months. I cataloged the right signals, the modest restaurants, the self-paid coffees, the genuine-sounding family obligation, and I filed them under confirmed. Then I stopped. I didn't keep investigating because I'd already reached the verdict I wanted. Here is the thing I've arrived at, sitting in Chiang Mai with enough time and enough quiet to look at it honestly. I'd been lonely since at least 2014. Possibly longer? The marriage to Annalie was not a happy one for the last several years, and I'd managed that by working, by keeping my hands occupied, by being very skilled at not looking at things directly. When Annalie left, the loneliness that was already there just became visible. And I got on a plane to Vietnam carrying it, and I refused to name it because naming it felt like admitting something I didn't want to admit. Lynn didn't bypass my defenses. She didn't have to. She walked through the gap I'd left open by refusing to acknowledge the gap existed. And she was good at reading that gap. Since she'd read it in someone else before me, I'm certain of that. The profile had been active for at least 9 months. I was not the first David Hartley. Here is what I would tell anyone watching this who is thinking about doing what I did. Keep your finances entirely separate for a minimum of 12 months. Not 9, not 10, 12. Regardless of how genuine the family obligations seem, and some of them will be genuinely, keep your money separate until you have 12 months of evidence, not 3. The pattern I missed only became visible across 8 months. If I'd had a hard rule of 12, I would have seen it in time. Understand Vietnamese family obligation culture before you meet her family. Read about it, talk to people who know it. I understand what filial piety actually means and what the realistic financial expectations are for the husband of an eldest daughter. If you go into that first family visit without that knowledge, you will make decisions in the moment based on emotion rather than understanding. I did. Don't. Tell someone back home what you're doing. Brahm. A daughter. Anyone. The absence of an outside perspective on my decisions was not a coincidence. I didn't tell anyone because telling someone would have meant having them ask questions I didn't want to answer about whether I was being sensible. That should have been information about the state I was in. And before you get on the plane, before any of this, have the honest conversation with yourself about what you're actually looking for. More not the version where you say you're just retiring somewhere affordable and you'll see what happens. The honest version. Because the gap that I left open and that she walked through would have been much smaller if I'd just looked at it directly before I arrived. Listen here. I spent 20 years learning to read other people so I didn't have to read myself. That's the only case I ever failed to close. That's Cobus van der Merwe, 47 years old, formerly of the South African Police Service Violent Crimes Unit, currently of a guest house in Chiang Mai with a good balcony and a pension that still clears every month. He lost around $27,000 in 8 months of his life. He did not lose his financial security, his health, or his ability to make different decisions going forward. Out in the taxonomy of inside Vietnam stories, that makes this one of the better outcomes. And it's a better outcome specifically because Cobus eventually did the one thing he was trained to do. He gathered evidence and he acted on it. I want to say something before we finish about the complexity this story contains. Some of the money Cobus spent was genuinely appropriate. The Tet contributions, the family support dynamic, the cultural expectations around an eldest daughter's foreign husband. These things are real. They are not invented by women looking to extract money from foreigners. They exist and they matter. And any man who comes to Vietnam expecting to build a life here needs to understand them before he arrives, not after he's already emotionally invested. What was not appropriate, what crossed from cultural expectation into something else, was the parallel profile, the financial targeting, the active deception running alongside the marriage. Those things aren't cultural complexity. They're a specific operation, and it had been running before Cobus and it continued after him. This story is not a warning against Vietnamese women. It is not a warning against Vietnam. It is a warning against arriving anywhere, with anyone, carrying a void you haven't named and hoping someone else will fill it without you having to admit it's there. If that describes where you are right now, take a breath before you book anything. If you've been through something like this yourself, the comment section is below and we read everything. Subscribe if you haven't, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. The channel exists because the stories that are hardest to tell are the ones most worth hearing. That's Inside Vietnam. We'll see you next time.